So although I've been working in this industry for about 10 years, I feel like still getting out and doing data collection sometimes is the really most powerful tool to understand how evaluation and testing can really build stronger interactives. So this is a picture from when we were doing the summative evaluation of the Science Behind Pixar exhibition that was hosted at the Museum of Science back in 2015. I was observing a family that had 2 boys and their mothers. The boys had cognitive disabilities, and so they were a part of our study and kind of looking at the accessibility of the exhibition. And as they moved through the gallery, they were manipulating all of the digital and physical sliders. They were watching all of the videos that were Pixar animators talking about how to do problem solving in animation. And one of them just kept saying, "I never want to leave this exhibit." And I feel like it's examples like that that really show the impact that informal learning environments can have on users in providing hands-on discovery, social participation, freedom of choice. I mean, that's really where we shine. And I think that that really comes from being thoughtful about user-centered design as you're developing your interactives. So we focus most of our work on universal design framework, where we're trying to create exhibits and spaces that we feel are welcoming for everyone. And we also look to the universal design for learning framework to ensure that our exhibits are providing multimodal opportunities for learning. And in the end, our goal really in creating anything is to ensure that our spaces and our exhibits are physically, cognitively, socially, and emotionally accessible to visitors. And when we conduct accessibility testing, we're not just focusing on the usability aspect of that. We're really interested in what the needs and preferences are of different audiences. Are they interested in learning about this? What kinds of things are contributing to learning exhibit goals? So it's a really more of a whole picture than just the usability point. So I'm just going to talk just a little bit about some of the practical strategies for doing evaluation and trying to get started in this work to understand more about the needs and preferences of visitors and potential visitors that in the end usually make experiences better for everyone. So considering a range of voices, in order to meet the needs of an audience, you really need to talk to that audience. It's important to really value their voices and their expertise. This is their lived experience. And you're trying to improve the design of whatever you're doing. You're not trying to change the individual. And so that is where their expertise really comes into play. Whenever we do testing, even people that have been designing exhibits for 20 years still are learning new things every time we have a new project arise, and as our technology changes. So at the Museum of Science, we have an accessibility committee that has some external experts as well as people internal that kind of oversee a lot of our exhibit development. We have an accessibility coordinator that helps to inform our overall approach to accessibility. And then, of course, we do accessibility testing where we're pulling in visitors and potential visitors to incorporate their feedback early on. We've also used personas as another strategy when we're building interactives. So we've taken data that are across many user testing sessions, and we've made different sort of user types. And I think that these can be really useful in starting these initial conversations about creating user-centered design. So the first set that we had created here was for a project called Creating Museum Media for Everyone. And we were trying to create touch table touch tables, touch screens that were usable to a broad audience. And so during the workshop phase, when we're trying to figure out what we want to design, and it had exhibit developers and museum personnel and technology experts. We used these personas to kind of walk through the different experiences that we wanted to create. And I think a really key part of these personas too is that it included their level of familiarity and comfort with technology and how they might use the museum, because those kind of pieces are just as important as the physical interaction with what you're doing. Getting creative with recruitment, I think that, I know when we do just a lot of our general testing, we're pulling people off the floor. We have so many visitors there at one time. And although, I know as Beth stated earlier, this is part of our museum population already. But sometimes when you're trying to get really focused feedback about something in the development area, you do need to kind of reach out of your box a little bit to figure out how to get these people to give you some feedback. So we've had a lot of luck in maintaining a spreadsheet of individuals that are interested in coming in to test, to do exhibit testing with us. So we record their different abilities, their group characteristics, their interests. We send that sign-up form a couple times a year. We invite people in. We know kind of what project they're working on with us. And then at the end of the year, we also share back a newsletter with them that talks about how the feedback that they've given us throughout the year has informed our projects and upcoming projects. Because it's really important to sort of share back with communities about how they've impacted the work that you're doing. But there's a lot of other ways of doing this as well. A lot of this, I think, revolves around maintaining relationships. So thinking about what kinds of things you already have going on in your institution that can help you bring individuals in to help out. Thinking about what this testing experience is actually going to be for the visitor. So it could be, thinking about how to design your instruments to be more accessible. It could be as simple as just having things in larger print, or making sure that if you're doing a survey, that it can also be read out loud as an interview, leaving space for people to write their own answers rather than yourself. When you bring people in, thinking about what happens as they walk through your door to when they exit. You want to create something, an exhibit that has enough for them to sort of interact with and for you to get meaningful feedback, but you also don't want to set them up for failure. You don't want to put something in front of someone that you absolutely know is not accessible to them, and it's going to be a bad visitor experience. So just thinking about how that whole testing session is going to sort of look and feel for the visitor experience. And as always, best practice is to be compensating individuals for their time and for their feedback. And I think that this one, anticipating change, is kind of the hardest sometimes for teams. Being really flexible and welcoming change for improvements. That's why we try to bring people in as early as possible. You don't want to harden what you're working on too quickly, because that makes it a lot harder for your team to be willing to kind of make a change once you have learned new information. So you want it to be hardened enough to be able to capture data that's useful for your process, but still having that flexibility to be able to make changes. This is an example from Science Behind Pixar. So it's called Surface Appearance Workstation, and what you're doing is using these different parameters to change the appearance of the sphere. So when we did accessibility testing, we brought in some visitors with limited mobility. And one thing that we really learned is that all the controls that were really necessary for engagement, some of them were in the top corners of the screen and people couldn't reach them. So we ended up moving the toolbar to the bottom part, and we got more feedback about how big the different swatches were and how to make things look touchable and not touchable. And this was just one example that we learned from, but we had multiple touch screens for a lot of different types of activities in the Science Behind Pixar. And so this feedback got extrapolated for the whole exhibition. And this is something that we'll continue to use as we create more exhibitions. So just thinking about how these kind of nuggets of feedback can further inform your work. Just to close, I heard this quote last week when I was at a different conference. We don't have to engage in grand heroic actions to participate in the process of change. And I think that that just really resonated with me with this type of work, that it doesn't have to be a really large, elaborate thing. The most important thing is that you get started and that you find some small areas to start make a difference, because that can really go a long way in getting your institution to do more of this type of work. I really feel like evaluation can be a really positive process, that you're learning what's best for your visitors and what's best for different audiences, and then being able to build on those practices as well as figure out where improvements can be made. Thank you so much.
Okay, so here's another take on accessibility. Accessibility and XR, or virtual and augmented and mixed reality, which many of you have probably heard of throughout the sessions from yesterday and today, including the first panel in the morning yesterday, when they talked about it more in the context of location-based entertainment and public events in museums. But when you're thinking about it, immersive media and spatial computing can be relevant for a much wider audience than they are today. Through VR and AR, we can bring the world closer and into everybody's homes and augment life at every ability, creating realistic experiences that defy distance and mobility constraints. I am Cezara Windrem with AARP Innovation Labs, and for the next few minutes I want to talk to you about making the world more accessible through VR and VR more accessible to all. AARP, as many of you probably well know, is a social mission nonprofit organization serving over 100 million people with more than 38 million members. Our mission is to empower people to choose how they live as they age and be everyday innovators in aging. Our work really ranges from everything that you know, advocacy and policy, but all through a full range of products and services, including media publications in all channels, including print, web, mobile, and well, now even virtual and immersive through the work in the labs, which is our kind of hub for all things innovation. And my role as part of the labs is that I'm heading up our work in virtual and augmented reality and employing immersive media and spatial computing beyond their traditional uses in location-based entertainment, enterprise, or video gaming, and more into solving some of the real-world problems and challenges that our society is facing today, such as social isolation, health and wellness, and improving the quality of life for people of all ages and abilities as they relate to aging, with a particular focus on mobility. So, XR. Well, first, what is it? We talk about it, but what is it and where did it come from? It's really not that new and definitely not sci-fi anymore. It's just a very natural next step in the evolution of humanity and the way we use technology to communicate, share, and access information, experiences, and data. And really, starting with the very first electronic message signal sent over 200 years ago as a telegram, and evolving into the telephone and then the radios in 1900s to television and first computers in the 40s and 50s, which all kept getting smaller and smaller and better throughout the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and all to the present day. But also from the very old days, humans explored opportunities for this full immersion and creation of new worlds. From the first kaleidoscope, through building on top of the growing technology in computing and graphics. In the past few decades, we've seen great applicability in large-scale enterprise solutions, government, space programs, and military simulations. These were further adopted by the LA and Silicon Valley-based gaming industry, further advancing on top of the latest developments in technology as computing power, screens, and communications technologies became cheaper and lighter. And today, immersive media and spatial tech give us this 360 degrees canvas to fully or partially, through VR or AR and mixed reality, immerse ourselves into and paint with any data, information, and interactive experiences that can be relevant for many different audiences. And so, really, the potential for using VR is huge, and scientific research from renowned institutions such as Stanford is showing it as well. When VR is done really well, it has true potential to trick the brain, the human brain, into actually experiencing it for real. So there is so much more to it than simulating fun imaginary worlds or creating military training scenarios. there's the opportunity to simulate life itself and create new experiences that feel good and create new memories with applications in a wide range of fields, to name just a few that are relevant to our conversation today, such as wellness and personal fulfillment. Through virtual reality, we can virtually travel the world, connecting with people, places, and things from the comfort of one's chair in their own living room, regardless of any physical mobility issues, if any. Then there's clinical use for distraction therapy and pain management, but also empathy building, like putting one in the shoes of another to better understand what their world might look like when they're impacted by disability or disease such as Alzheimer's, macular degeneration, or blindness, like in this beautiful award-winning production based on John Hall's memoirs that I was going to show you a trailer of, but I think in the interest of time, I will move on and kind of talk more about bringing the world to you through these emerging technologies. And particularly what we're seeing is that VR indeed can bring the world to you, and particularly travel and discovery of the world is one of the most rewarding activities for humankind. In fact, AARP travel research findings are showing that travel has direct impact on health levels, and that occurs during travel itself, but also have long-lasting effects afterwards. However, how many people cannot travel as much, especially as they age and mobility might decrease? With VR, on the other hand, we can bring the world itself, its sites and museums, directly into people's homes and lives, which is what we started working on at the AARP Innovation Labs. And we did a lot of research, putting the user at the center of it all and applying design thinking to look into how people perceive virtual reality and what matters to them, to understand how we could make the world more accessible through VR, while at the same time turning it the other way as well and making VR more accessible and more relevant to all. And what we've learned is really that the critical aspect lays in the content. And it is the duty of all of us to create more and better content that is simple, accessible, and relevant. Particularly, we found great opportunities around casual entertainment, travel, health and wellness, and family. And so we created a platform of curated content that takes into account the needs and considerations of an ageless consumer and brings cross-generational families together in VR. We named it Alcove. We launched it at CES in January of this year, and I'm calling it a platform of content because we built it in such a way that any creator, artist, or developer in the world could be part of it as long as they create content that is relevant for all. We've been getting amazing feedback, even though we're still early and only in beta. People are using it with their families and absolutely love it. And it's publicly available on the Oculus Go. If you have one at home, you can check it out on your own. But I'll also share with you a very quick trailer. Hopefully the volume is up. can see, unlike most commercially available experiences in VR, users step into this welcoming home that's built at human scale with familiar elements that help build a trust with the new environment and the new medium. And from there, they start to discover the magic that awaits for them in VR. Well, with that, that wraps up my talk. So let the panel conversations begin.
About accessibility or inclusion during your work, during different projects that you've been working on?
Okay, so I can start. Well, we definitely had, especially when it comes to new mediums such as virtual reality, which is started by, at least on the commercial side, the younger developers in Silicon Valley who are developing for their peers. They're definitely not taking into consideration everyone. And that is really part of our mission and why we really felt like we need to take the lead in this new thing and see if we can work with them and create things that can actually bring this beautiful, beautiful new medium to everybody and make it in a way that is not scary or overwhelming or just bringing that feeling of VR is not for me, that's for games, right? That's for kids, which honestly is the thing that we most hear from people whenever we've done testing and we had users in our labs to discuss virtual reality with them. Their very first reaction is, hey, it's really cool that you have me here for VR, but what is it? Or I've heard of it, and oftentimes we prompt them with the question, who is it for? And more often than not, the answer is, it's for kids. My grandkids have one, or oh, my daughter bought one for her kids last Christmas. It's not until they start looking at curated elements and curated content that is made with their needs in mind and their perspective in mind that they open up and they realize, wow, this is indeed a huge opportunity. Can pass it off. Who wants it next?
Sure, I'm happy to go. So this is the surprises, right? I think one of the things that I learned early on that was surprising is just because someone could use a technology or access a technology doesn't actually mean that they want to or they will. And so a lot of what we're talking about here is really behavior change, right? If we're talking about individuals who have a habit of not going to visual art museums, how do you then get them in the door? How do you design an experience that they will then want to do? And so I think thinking about both, right? Like you need to think about accessibility so someone can access that content, but also thinking about, well, why would they, or how can we get them more excited about that?
I guess one thing that I learned and that I keep learning over and over is, you know, when you start with a project, you go in with a certain set of assumptions that, you know, you've learned over time that you think something is going to be appropriate for a certain audience or a certain audience wants something this way. And I guess this really highlights the importance of user feedback and iteration and testing and, you know, just improving the product over time is that we can go in with the best kind of intentions for a product or a project that we're working on, but when you place it in the hands of users and visitors, assumptions are almost always broken. Uh, so yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Okay.
I would probably piggyback on that too, where there's a lot of nuance in a lot of different versions of disability. If you've met one person who's blind, that person's experience can be very, very different than another person's experience, and there's a lot of range within that one spectrum. So trying to get as many people in as possible and really listening to the kinds of experiences that they have and the feedback that they have to share is just going to make whatever you're doing a little bit stronger.
So, based on your work, what do you think about designing alternative experiences for people with disabilities versus designing an experience to be inclusive? And under what circumstances might your response change? You want to start, Leanne?
Yeah, I can start. So our overall approach is universal design, and we are trying to make the one experience that we're having multimodal, lots of ways for people to interact with it, whether it's tactile or audio or visual, but in making sure that those are all meaningful ways to interact. I will say we're working on a project right now where we're trying to have people understand how scientists use technology in the Arctic. And we've got this big, beautiful vista, and there's animals in it, and there's one side of it is a very visual activity, and you're using technology on this screen to try to locate the animals and stuff. And on the other side, we've got this sort of glacier space, and we've got a all audio experience. And both what's happening in the vista and what's happening with the glacier, it has the same exhibit goals. It's doing the same thing of using different technology. The one with the ice flow is using hydrophone technology, so you're like dropping your hydrophone down the water, listening to animal sounds and trying to understand what's in the water. And so we're in the middle of testing that right now, and I feel like it's a different approach for us because they're both parallel experiences as part of one larger experience, but one is more accessible to someone who's blind or low vision, and one is more accessible to maybe somebody who's deaf or hard of hearing. So that's one place we're thinking about at the moment.
So I don't know if I'm going to be answering your question directly as the way it was posed, but I guess one of the things that I've experienced when working with technology in terms of creating a solution is that people always kind of assume that technology is going to solve all of their issues, right? And that is almost never the case. So when I try to work on something, I try to work on it as an additional layer, an additional kind of modality or medium that somebody can experience something in, fully recognizing that that can't be the only solution. When we were doing the Yayoi Kusama exhibition with the infinity rooms as they were designed had very narrow entrances. They were designed back in the 1960s by the artist, and we were limited in terms of changing that artwork. So we couldn't expand the kind of entryway for visitors with physical mobility disabilities. So we decided to create a VR version of the room to kind of provide as an alternative experience for people that couldn't physically enter the space. We went into the project with kind of our best intent in terms of trying to provide an audience with, this limitation, something that would allow them to experience what everybody else is experiencing. But ultimately, what we learned was, it's a copycat. It's not the actual experience itself. So we learned a lot from doing that. I think it was a good first step in trying to leveraging VR technology for, providing these types of experiences, but, ultimately we have to kind of, come back to reality and accept that, it is right now at this state a alternative experience and not the experience itself.
Yeah, that's spot on. And really, the technology where it is now, or well, rather where it's been in the past 2 to 3 years, it still has a bit of way to go. So it's getting better and better. I think right now in 2019, with the new Quest out on the market, with the Go that came out just a bit over a year ago, things are getting so much better. But with things that we've built in the past few years, there's still experiences that are inducing nausea. I mean, I've tried one just 2 days ago, and I work with VR. I work with VR, and I'm very used to it, and everything that we've put into our experience, we've been testing for that to make sure that we eliminate as much as possible or minimize to the most of our abilities that potential to make somebody dizzy, because the frame rate and the movement in VR and the video quality and all that can easily go the other way, and you can end up with the opposite of the experience you're trying to create. So really, the good results are when VR is done well, which I think we're starting to get there. As of 2019, it's only gonna get better and better from here, but we definitely have to be very cognizant of that. And as we're working on the user experience, keep that in mind as #1 factor of importance to address. And really, to kind of go back to your question, from our work, we pretty much addressed both. And if anything, we addressed more the first than the latter. Particularly, what we realized is that there's so many people that slow down as they age. Even though there's still so many opportunities out there for them, I have very close to my heart my own family, my own grandmother, who unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago. In the past over a decade of her life, she hardly left her home. She refused to have to go anywhere. She just preferred to do what she's comfortable with, which is watching TV and reading books. She kept her brain stimulated through those activities, but that's not enough. And I was living in a different country. I was here, she was in Europe. We connected over the internet. We got her to travel a little bit by using Google Earth, which back then on a tiny screen computer, a flat computer, was the most we could do. Well, in today's world, you can use virtual reality to fully immerse somebody into a different geography, into a different part of the world, into a museum, even if they're not ready to leave their house or they don't want to. Yes, it's never gonna replace reality. Technology, no matter how great will become, will never replace what we can do for real. However, when you're thinking about media throughout the centuries, what we've gotten to in this point in time with immersive media is probably the closest to reproducing reality as we know it than any other medium has been able to, like those flat screens that we're looking at, right, with the side of our eye. So.
Thank you.
So I think this is a really interesting and really complicated question, and I would like to spend weeks discussing it. And there's not an easy answer. I think there's merit and value for both. I personally land on the whatever the thing is, design it for as many people to have that experience or some meaningful experience with that thing. However, there are certain times and certain constraints and certain realities where you can't do that and you have to make a separate experience. And the word of advice that I want to give is if you are creating a separate experience, to be very, very careful about the messaging for that. It can be sometimes a little easy to say, oh, this is the, in quotes, disabled version. This is the right, and add labels to it. And so try and be very neutral with the curation of what it is, and instead describe what are the things that both experiences provide, and let your visitors decide where they want to go and what they want to interact with. And I'll get off my soapbox.
Would each of you please list one thing you consider to be a best practice in accessible or inclusive design? Do you want to start, Amy?
I'm holding the microphone. Uh-oh. So I have so many. I wanted to give snaps to Leanne for saying always pay your participants. That was what I had prepared for this. So often individuals from these user groups that we're talking about are unemployed, or there's very high rates of unemployment. And just recognizing and appreciating their time has tremendous value and weight. But that wasn't going to be my answer. My answer was going to be to think about and recognize that oftentimes you may be designing for more than one person when you're thinking about accessibility. I talk a lot about teams of individuals who go through life or go through school or do tasks. And so just recognizing in the environment there might be a caregiver, a parent, a partner, a teammate, involved, and kind of thinking about what is that interaction for two.
Yes, test and iterate. Iterate, iterate, iterate. Don't just assume that because you've tested with 5 people and you got good feedback, that's it. Everything has to go through this continuous process of improvement. And really, at AARP Innovation Labs, when we've built our VR experience, we want to be inclusive, but we want to make it relevant for anybody. So we started more with this concept of bringing families together. If it's gonna be good for grandma, probably the grandchild would like it too. The other way around might not necessarily be the case, but just think about it. When you're developing a website, you want it to work on all different browsers. You're gonna test it for Internet Explorer and Safari and Mozilla. You know how many users Mozilla has now? Very, very little compared to the other ones, but still, we do it, we test it because we want it to work for those users who have Mozilla. Well, people with disabilities of all ranges add up to way more than a Mozilla user. So if we're gonna test a website for every browser out there, why wouldn't we do the same with the different components of any sort of computer interactive experience that we build?
So they already answered for me. But I guess going back to what I said earlier was provide multiple kind of access points, multiple experiences, multiple ways to experience something. Don't just rely on technology. And if you are going to rely on technology, at least create multiple ways to interact with it.
I would say one of the things we learned on a project a couple of years ago is just being really mindful about the format that you're using to share your content. We were working on a project and it had haptic and it had tactile and it had audio and there was a screen with a graph. And when we took it to do testing, we had all these like multimodal things and absolutely nobody could understand what we were doing or what was supposed to be happening, and they didn't want to interact with it at all. And so instead we were in process of prototyping it, but we created something that just was inaccessible to everyone. And so it kind of took our team to sort of pull back a little bit and be like, what actually seems like a genuine way of interacting with whatever content we're trying to show, and how can we make that really the best that it can be so that it's something that people want to interact with.
Thank you. Let's turn it over to questions from the audience.
I'm curious, what's going on with development of XR for people with visual disabilities?
That's a really good question, and I will tell you, I know there's at least one company out there that is trying to tackle this. If you want to follow up with me after this, I don't remember their name top of my head, but I can find the information and share it. There's definitely, virtual reality, you put on a headset, it's all visual. There's ways you can address that through the voiceover activations and whatnot. Our current product doesn't have all the nuts and bolts that it should have, including the fact that it has text that you have to read. And we know that, we're working on it. As I said, it's early access and a beta version. But I do know there's research that's been done, and some startups out there are testing opportunities for creating a different kind of projection on the retina. As I said, feel free to connect with me, and I'd love to share more as I get the info.
If I can add too, there's a lot happening in the world of spatial audio, so it's how do you direct different kinds of sounds so it can feel like you're really in that environment. And then the other place that we're seeing a lot is haptics. So what are different kinds of technologies that can simulate different sorts of touch or environmental considerations? And then a little bit of smell, sometimes that happens, sometimes taste, they'll like pop a mint in your mouth or something.
Other questions?
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation from all the panelists, but I was intrigued with what Leanne mentioned of your prototype, the exhibition that you're prototyping right now either in the Arctic or in Antarctica, and you mentioned that you have a split screen, with two exhibits. If I understood it correctly, there are two split screen with two different presentations. And then one was, it was basically two exhibitions on one screen intended to different audiences. Did I understand that correctly?
So it's actually two separate areas of that exhibition space.
Oh, I see.
So it's in one gallery, and on one side there's a vista, and it's got different stations where you can like fly a drone around to locate animals, use GPS to locate animals. And as part of that same exhibit, just another part of sort of that continued vista, there's an ice flow. And then that part, you're using the hydrophone to be able to understand, or to be able to locate animals in the water.
So to me, it seems like the two exhibits have different strengths, if you will, in terms of accessibility. So in my mind, accessibility was more like what the webmaster from Hirshhorn mentioned, that you were replicating a virtual reality of something that was physical. But I think what Leon mentioned were kind of a different options, right, for different people. Has different kind of access. And I was wondering if, so the access would be different because the exhibitions present different elements. It's not like a replication of the physical into the digital. So I was wondering if you could comment on that. Is this kind of the direction that people in your field are actually going? So you can have one exhibit addressing a certain kinds of people with different senses, or so in other words, it's moving from replicating the physical into the digital. Exactly.
So I feel like the decision with that exhibit was that we knew that this was sort of where this exhibit overall was going to be going, about using technology in this Arctic environment. And what we really wanted to make sure is that we weren't, one of the coolest things in the gallery wasn't inaccessible to an entire group of people. And so we were trying to think about how to make this sort of overall exhibit experience that had different ways of engaging the senses in a couple of different places. And I think that is the approach that we are at least taking right now. I can't think of actually other examples of us really doing that necessarily in other parts of the museum. We really try to make things all sort of happen in the same place, but it's somewhere we're trying to push at the moment to see, because they're both things are the same exhibit, they're both connecting the same exhibit goals. You're using the technology, and people have sort of the choice to use whatever these three stations works best for them or they're interested in.
Any other questions?
Oh, yep. I have a question about sensory integration issues. It doesn't really fit in the physical, cognitive, social, and emotional. It's sort of all of the above. And I'm just wondering about best, latest practices. I've noticed sensory rooms in airports for people who can't deal with a lot of crowds and noise and all of that. And, especially like with VR, how does that work? Thank you.
Yeah, there's so much that we could do and still need to do, right, to solve all of these issues. Definitely not something that we are actively looking into today. I know the sensory information has been applied in a various different kind of experiences, like the 4D cinemas and whatnot, but that's really addressing different needs. However, I would be so looking forward to the day when that kind of room where you can just run away from it all will exist. And I think there's a lot of work that our society will have to keep doing in order to get us there.
So yes, I think there's tremendous opportunity for the world of VR to provide individualized and controlled sensory experiences. But one thing that I've seen some museums do, I mentioned it briefly at the tenement, but I'll actually speak to something that the Walters Museum in Baltimore does, is they have, I think they're monthly things called sensory mornings, where they open up the museum before traditional hours. They invite parents and children to come in, and then there's they've taken the museum and then they've made it much more calming with sensory in mind, and they have different kinds of activities that are, again, calming, but they also bring out special things, so there's kind of this like, oh wow, I want to go to a sensory morning so I can see what's behind the glass and get to touch it. Yeah, so I've seen, just to throw that in.
And I'll just make a pitch for our own Smithsonian Morning at the Museum program, if you're not aware of it, that we are doing that type of programming and have been for 10 years. And all of the Smithsonian museums are now participating. We usually do about 18 to 20 programs a year, and it's very, very popular. But what I love is that we are now actually adding to our options for people, that we're building some purpose-built spaces for quiet rooms. So in the Air and Space renovation, the plan is for the family center that'll be in the lower level, that there'll be a large play area, there'll be a family care restroom, there will be a nursing room for mothers, and also there will be a quiet room. So a range of things that will give people hopefully better amenities, more comfort while they're within the museum.
If I may add, I think to that point, it makes so much more sense to apply this in the real world rather than in VR. I mean, VR is not necessarily the medium for it, as of today at least.
Okay, I think that's all we have time for right now. If I'd like to ask everybody to give our panelists a round of applause. Thank you. We break for lunch now. If I could ask you to be back between 1:15 and 1:20. Thank you.